Who is going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia?
Comrades, there's a phrase that emerged from the Wisconsin revolt in the United States earlier this year. This was the end of one-sided class war. The idea that our side was fighting back. And over the last 8 months in Britain, it's been absolutely clear that our side is fighting back. And you felt it on Thursday and in the press coverage on Thursday. There are two lies that are always told by the bourgeoisie about strikes. Either it's a complete flop, total failure, or on the other side, it's holding the country to ransom, disgracefully, by a minority of troublemakers. The Daily Mail managed to have both of them in one edition. The main headline was "The Day Britain Defied the Militants." Turn over 2 pages. 11,000 schools were hit and the biggest teachers' walkout in a generation. But far from defying the militants had achieved tremendous support across Britain. And when, of course, those sorts of lies fail, what follows is slurs and slander. I don't know whether you may have missed this in the bubble of Marxism, but the Mail report then was, this is how to use a tragedy. Girl 13, crushed to death by a falling branch as she sat on a park bench because her teachers were on strike. I mean, what a disgusting way of using someone's death to try and cover. There's another page on it and full pictures today in the Daily Mail that this girl died because of the teachers' strike. I mean, absolute disgraceful. We're going to need far more of the sorts of events that we saw on Thursday, because the capitalist crisis continues, and the backdrop to almost everything we speak about at Marxism is the continuing existence of an intractable crisis inside the economic system. Nearly 3 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, which signalled the crisis, 2 years after the official end of the US recession, and over a year since the British economy was supposed to have turned round, it's clear that none of the factors that produced the deepest slump since the 1930s have yet been remotely solved. And there remains huge questions about any form of recovery inside the world economy and any sense of stability, even within the banking system itself, which has had trillions of pounds and dollars and euros pumped into it. If you read the World Bank forecast for growth this year, which is probably an optimistic forecast, by the way, it is one that shows that economic growth across the world will be dramatically lower than it was last year. In other words, that the emergence of prosperity, of stability, in 2010 is again turning down in terms of 2011. And not simply does it say that there are fears about mass unemployment and poverty in the United States and Europe, but also in China, India and Brazil also facing increasing economic problems, leading to people like Nouriel Roubini to talk about a perfect storm of fiscal deficits in the United States, a slowdown in China, European debt defaults and stagnation in Japan. And whatever the specifics of that process may be, there's a very good discussion of it in the front piece of the International Socialism Journal, the new one that's out at the moment. It is clear that this intractable crisis continues inside the whole of the global economy. And in Britain it's clear as anything that growth has flatlined over the last year, even before the full extent of the public expenditure cuts hit, which will undoubtedly mean more unemployment, less demand and further layoffs in the future. What they're all clear about, however, is, of course, who is going to pay for this crisis. That after a period in which the response was to pump huge amounts of money into the banking system in the hope that this would kickstart economic growth, across the globe now, we see the rapacious demand for cuts and more cuts. That the methods of the medieval doctors, that the patient is being bled, and if the patient does not recover, then more blood must be drained from them, is once again dominating the economic discourse of governments. And as part of that, also a vicious attack on welfare across the world. Again, you may have missed the speech by one of the ministers in Nicolas Sarkozy's government last week, in which he said that people on benefits were a cancer of French society. A cancer of French society. And that's replicated across the governments, who are turning in the most vicious, scapegoating manner. Philip Davis, the Tory MP, saying that the solution for disabled people was to hawk themselves to employers at less than the minimum wage. £5.93 an hour, too much to hope. If you're disabled, instead, you must crawl around saying to employers, can you take me on at £4 an hour because I recognise I'm not as good as anybody else. And we see in Greece the laboratory of social experimentation. The cuts have failed, and now we must unveil a new package of cuts, of more assaults upon wages, of further privatisation, of the imposition of groups of foreign experts who will come in to police the process of privatisation and assaults upon working people. Anything that is publicly owned must be hawked around for sale. And yet the ruling classes are terrified that none of this will work, that they fear two things in the case of Greece. One is that it may trigger a repeat of the Lehman Brothers experience, a banking crisis that will drag down the French and German banks that have lent so much money, and the British banks as well, to Greece, and that the contagion will spread to Portugal and to Spain and to Ireland and further across the Eurozone. That's one fear. The second fear, which is in some ways more interesting to us, is that they cannot actually impose it on Greek workers. It's one thing to pass a law, it may well be another thing to actually make Greek workers accept what that austerity package says. There's an interesting editorial in the pages of City AM, which is the sort of Financial Times very light that you get given free on the London Underground, which the editor, who could always be relied upon for a red in tooth and claw capitalist comment of it, says the problem we've seen now in Britain and in Greece is that the majority of the population simply don't understand what a budget deficit means. They simply don't understand that they can't keep having their luxurious forms of lifestyle. And we haven't won this argument yet, and we have to batter them through somehow to make them understand it. And that's the great battle, of course, which we've seen over the last year. And of emergence of resistance on a world scale, which is at a greater level of anything we've seen since the 1960s. Of course, the primary inspiration of the actuality of revolution in Egypt and Tunisia, and the spread of the uprisings to Yemen, to Bahrain, to Syria, and to Libya, offering not only the clear evidence that revolution is not simply a memory or an aspiration, but is a reality in the 21st century. That it is possible to tear down oppression and exploitation. It is possible for ordinary people to transform their lives and to transform the societies around them. And not simply to pull away Hosni Mubarak, but also because of the continuing process of the Egyptian revolution, to give a vision of how ordinary people could conquer economic power and political power, and to change not just the shape of those who rule over them, but also to transform society in its entirety. That's what we get from the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions, and also, of course, a hope for the Palestinian people that the endless cycle of repression, of resistance, can be broken and new possibilities opened up in that defiant and heroic struggle. In Wisconsin, we did see the highest level of struggle by American workers for a quarter of a century. In China, supposedly the proof that it is possible for capitalism to expand forever. The strikes in Foxconn, in Honda, recently the protests in Guangzhou, the city which produces a third of the world's genes, of workers fighting back in ways that haven't been seen in China for a very long time. The mass strikes in France, in Spain, in Portugal and in Greece. The explosive movements on the streets, the great 12th of March movement in Portugal, where 3 young people started a Facebook group, and on the 12th of March, 200,000 people marched on the streets of Lisbon. 200,000 out of a population, the whole population of Portugal, of some 10.5 million. That's what was achieved in Portugal. The occupations of the squares in Spain and in Syntagma Square now in Athens and in other countries. And what you see from that, of course, is the unity across the world of how one method, the occupation of Tahrir Square, becomes something in Spain, becomes something in Athens, can become something somewhere else. And it's foolish to simply equate all these different parts of struggle. It's not enough to put an equal sign against all of them. But the greater danger is to miss the links and the commonalities. It's 2,000 miles from Puerta del Sol to Tahrir Square, but the social distance is far less. That people get inspiration one from another. They copy methods and slogans. They achieve strength from the struggles in other parts of the world. And if it's not an equal sign between these different forms of struggle, nor is it simply a plus sign, not simply an addition sign, it's a multiplication sign, whereby one struggle is lifted by what happens in another part of the globe. And this is all true in Britain as well. It's very important to now recognise that we are part of this process. No longer do we simply have to applaud what's going on in other parts of the world. We are in the same trench as those struggling in Cairo or Athens or Madrid. Not at the same pitch, not at the same pace, not always over the same issues, but we are part of that same process. And therefore there are very big questions in front of us. This Marxism is a great event, but we should also recognise it's important because it has to be a laboratory of ideas and a council of war, somewhere to determine how we are going to take forward the challenges and the opportunities that are in front of us as socialists and as revolutionaries. It's serious, it matters. It's no longer simply an academic discussion, it's happening. And we have to be able to give leadership and guidance to those that are beginning to fight. It began with the students shattering the consensus that it was impossible to fight and to defeat the Tories. Incredible inspiration which remains important in how things move forward today. And then the 26th of March, the biggest trade union demonstration in British history. Let's say it again, the biggest trade union demonstration in British history. People thought that perhaps the working class was finished, that we wouldn't see organised groups of workers coming out again. And that's what we saw on the 26th of March. The organised working class on the streets, showing the potentiality of power. And then on the 30th of June, the organised working class not simply marching, but striking, using their economic strength to take up a political argument. And on the 30th of June, there are other meetings about it, but let's be sure that what was important was the confidence, the participation, the size of the picket lines, the strength and mood of the demonstrations, not simply in London, but in many other parts of Britain. Now, as the Socialist Workers' Party, we were criticised a few months ago for overemphasising the importance of the 30th of June. of saying that this was a key focus for working class militants and for socialists in Britain, that we had to bend every effort to make sure that 30th of June would be a success, because when organised workers begin to move in coordinated strike action, this is a heavy blow against the other side. And we plead guilty to emphasising the 30th of June. After the 26th of March, we had a discussion in the party, and the document that we produced, I'm glad to say, is now shiningly correct. Not always true, I should say, about everything we produce. But the reality is it is correct. It said the key focuses were to struggle where we were, in our workplaces and communities, to fight for coordinated action, to stress the importance of 30th of June, and to fight for a general strike. And we were right about that, because 30th of June has transformed the political landscape in Britain. It has begun to show how we can have not simply cries of anger about what the Tories and Lib Dems are doing, but the potential to get rid of that government, the potential to bring them down. And you know, the importance of the ideas we discuss here, you can sometimes underestimate. You see, why these discussions are important is whether you focus upon the question, for example, of the organised working class, of social power held by workers at the point of production. Fashionable to denigrate, of course, that's all finished. That's all ended. But we've defended it, and it's important we defend it, not simply in the British experience, but look at the Egyptian revolution. The Egyptian revolution, of course, is not a trade union matter. The Egyptian revolution was based upon a whole number of factors, of political factors, of the movement around the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the movement against the IMF, the revolts that filled the squares of Tahrir and Alexandria, had many elements. But one of the crucial elements in leading up to it, with a year or two in advance, was the heroic struggles of organised workers, of the tax collectors, of Mahala and of the steel workers. That was a crucial component in producing the aspects of the Egyptian revolution. And what was the final matter that convinced the ruling classes that they had to dump Mubarak? It was when factory after factory went on strike just before the fall of Mubarak and made it impossible for them to continue, because they feared that their whole system was going to go down with him unless they got rid of him very, very quickly. The power of workers who walked out across Egypt was what in the end tipped the balance. It's not syndicalism, it's not meek trade unionism to talk about the importance of organised workers. Organised workers at the point of production, people who can challenge and tear down the system, remain central to any project of social transformation. There was an interesting article in the Financial Times after the 30th of June strikes, which quoted a Tory insider who said, "Our worry about the strikes is that they might continue and then they will have an effect on the economy." Brilliant! What fantastic minds they must have inside the portals of power. Yes, that's right. In the end, if workers don't turn up, it has an effect on the economy. Sometimes others on the left need to remember this. But we don't approach this, as I say, through a matter of trade unionism. For us, the working class has to be at the centre of a wider revolt, involving all the elements in society who want to fight back against the exploitation and oppression that we face, that they pull around them all those elements in the anti-cuts movement of pensioners, of students, of school students, of disability campaigners, of the people who've been involved around the question of the tax dodgers, UK Uncut and so on, that the working class, when it moves, and we saw this on Thursday, can become a focus which pulls around it in a strong manner all of those people who want to fight, that it can become a magnet pulling together all of those who want to be on the side of resistance. And that's why now A key struggle is to campaign for the 30th of June to be a beginning, not an end of the process. For us to insist and to campaign and to agitate for a strike in the autumn, which will not be 750,000 on strike, but 3 or 4 million workers on strike together. And we want to put the pressure on the trade union leaders to name the day for that action, and to pull together a huge response by workers. And it will be a struggle, let's be clear about this. It won't simply fall from the skies. There will have to be a political struggle in workplaces and communities and colleges up and down Britain in order to make sure that enough pressure is piled on those at the top of Unison and Unite and the GMB that they cannot slither out of having to call that action. That the words that came from Dave Prentice at the Unison conference, the welcome words of saying that there is the potential for the biggest level of action since 1926 have to be turned into reality. And that can't be left to Dave Prentice. It's a matter of us organising as widely as possible to do so. And the initiative that was taken in this room before the strikes and in a number of other meetings in Britain around the Unite the Resistance initiative to pull together wide layers of people in the trade union movement and some elements of people inside the trade union leaderships themselves is part of that process, an important part of that process of making sure that we increase the pressure on people at the top of the unions. And as we do that, we pull together the networks of people who will be needed to carry forward the struggle afterwards. Because as we've seen from France or Spain or Greece, even the achievement of a very high level of strike action doesn't end the question of the way forward and of the political and economic struggle. No, instead it poses those questions at a much higher level. It poses those questions where even more is at stake. And therefore for us, we have to both push forward what happens at the top and build at the bottom of the unions. And building those rank and file networks is extremely important. But let's just be clear how much has changed. A year ago, when we began to talk about a general strike, people scoffed at it. People thought it was an impossible dream. The reality now is, who are the dreamers? Those who scoff at the idea of a general strike, or those who believe that there is any other way to really carry forward the struggle which can defeat the Tories. And we will need to have an understanding of how to work both with and against the trade union leaders, of recognising that yes, again and again they have held back struggle. Again and again they have failed to carry forward the potential and possibilities of struggle to victory, that they haven't given the lead that should have been coming from those people. Nevertheless, we don't need either opportunistic vagueness or sectarian aloofness. We also have to be able to work with those people inside the trade union movement who are prepared to give a lead. So if trade union leaders are taking their people out, if they're taking them onto the streets, if they're pushing for coordinated action, we will work with them in order to achieve those strikes. We will do our best. And not just the people on the left. Let's be clear, when the TUC, Brendan, Barber and all, called for the 26th of March demonstration, it was important for everyone to get behind it. It was a crucial turning point. It's not enough simply to say, too little, too late. We have to use every opportunity. This is the lesson from Europe, the lesson from France. They got the mass pension strikes because they used the call of the official to raise the level of struggle and to strengthen the unofficial elements. In Greece, the trade union bureaucracies were originally against general strikes. They were pushed from it because activists used the official calls to widen the unofficial possibilities and to raise the level of struggle. And we have to do the same thing here. And at the same time as that key message goes out, we want a strike by millions in the autumn. Name the day, fight everywhere to get it. At the same time that message goes out, we don't ignore the wider possibilities of anti-cuts mobilisations, both in our localities and on a higher level, that it is possible that we should have a huge demonstration at the Tory party conference on the 2nd of October. We want a huge demonstration, and the pitch is simple. If you want to tear the head off Cameron, Osborne and the rest of the Tory cabinet, come to Manchester on the 2nd of October in your thousands, and let's have a huge demonstration which shows the hatred and anger, but also is an organising form that can push for the general strike, that can push for a wider level of activity. And we're prepared to work with people in the Labour Party in those anti-cuts formations. We don't have a horror of thinking that because someone is a Labour Party member or a Labour Party supporter and doesn't sign up to every dot and comma of our programme that we're refusing to work with them. No, we want to work with everybody who is prepared to actively engage themselves against the cuts. But at the same time, we have to know that the Labour Party leadership's programme is grossly inadequate, a betrayal of the hopes of working class people. Dave Prentice, who can't be accused of being a gut hater of the Labour Party, said it right at the Unison Conference recently. Labour built the bridge over which the Tories now march. Prentice was right about that. They did lay the basis for the tuition fee increase. They did lay the basis for the attacks on benefits. They did lay the basis for the attacks upon immigration and asylum. They did lay the basis for the assaults upon workers' rights. They did lay the basis for all of the sorts of assaults that the Tories and the Lib Dems are marching through now. And when you look at what's happening around Blue Labour and Ed Miliband's speech of saying that we don't want either the greed of the bankers or the greed of the benefit scoundrels, the denunciation of these strikes, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise in truth. It shouldn't be a surprise. The Labour Party has never supported strikes, let's be clear about that. But nonetheless, for Miliband to refuse to support the strike on Thursday was a disgrace. A disgrace that even some of his own supporters have recognised. One woman who was a volunteer for his leadership contest said that watching him on television, trying to give a justification of why he wasn't supporting the strikes, was like watching a hostage video. And you get that sense of someone who didn't know what to say about how they were going to do this. Inevitably, there will be other issues. Let me mention two. One is that across the world, this level of austerity cannot be pushed through simply by democratic methods. That again and again, the ruling class will break from simply asking you to vote to slit your own throat, to smashing protest in the street. And the question of the defence of the rights of protest is an important element that we all ought to be involved in, of defending people's rights, not simply to go on the streets, but to strike, to demonstrate, to occupy, to take our anger and our protests onto the street. And the best way we do that is by coming together in support of those rights, but also using those rights. That's the best way that you always carry that forward. And another key struggle is that of racism against racism and the far right. And in particular, the national demonstration in Tower Hamlets on the 2nd of September, that we will need to have everyone challenge the EDL in Tower Hamlets to make sure that they do not make any sort of a breakthrough. And they rest, of course, on something much wider, which is Cameron's speech saying that multiculturalism had failed, and then the speech that Ian Duncan Smith is going to make, I believe, today in Madrid, in which he will say that British workers must come first in order for the British economy to be able to get rid of unemployment. It's interesting they always make these in foreign capitals. Cameron, well, not capitals, Cameron in Munich, Ian Duncan Smith in Madrid. I don't know whether it's about the history of some of these places they like, but anyway, that's where they come out. They come out with their more vile, racist expression. And also, there will be other issues that will be raised, which socialists need to rise to. Because we need a political alternative. We need the struggle. We need what's happening in the workplaces. We need the millions on strike in autumn. But we also need a political alternative that is put forward to the ideas of capitalism. That we need to popularise the slogans of not paying the debts, of taking over the banks, not simply in the method by which it's been done under capitalist control, but also under workers' control, of taxing the rich, of taking the huge wealth at the top of society and using it for the benefit of everybody. And that will only happen. That will only happen if we have a stronger socialist organisation at the centre of all of these revolts. The Socialist Workers' Party is not the linchpin upon which the entirety of the British working class moves. I wish it were, but it isn't. But what socialists in the SWP have done is important in agitating for strikes on a local level, on pushing for resistance, on trying to get a fight back where otherwise there would not have been a fight back. And we look at a whole number of councils in which that's occurred, where people have played a crucial role in agitating for the 26th of March. Of course, the process was much bigger. Of course, it was inspired by the students, by the Egyptian Revolution, and so on. But nonetheless, what individuals do makes a difference. In pushing for the 30th of June, at the tops of unions, and getting strikes in crucial areas, but also pushing for the coordination of those strikes. And in the future, it will become even more important. We need a socialist organisation which is strong enough to say the question of getting millions out on strike in autumn is a key thing. We have to fight for it together. We have to organise together. We have to make sure that the full weight of the working class is brought to make sure that it happens. That can't happen spontaneously. It has to be organised and brought together and discussed democratically and make sure that that is carried through. It isn't automatic that there will be a huge counter-mobilisation to the EDL in Tower Hamlets. It's not automatic that there will be a response in support of those women who marched on the slut walks. Whatever the difficulties with some of the slogans that were raised, it was right to stand against those who blamed women for rape, and it will be right. I shudder to think what the press coverage will be like over the Dominic Strauss-Kahn case, of how it will be saturated with the view that women make up allegations, and particularly black women make up allegations. And we will need an organisation which can both agitate for the strikes in the autumn and take up questions of racism and oppression and women's liberation at the same time. And that's what we are trying to build. And it can't be a matter that is dealt with haphazardly or without a real understanding of turning potential into reality. That the debates we have here are about thrashing out where we're going as a class, as socialists, to make sure that we have a socialist spine at the centre of all the different struggles that are taking place, to pull them together, to focus them around where we are strongest, and to move on. Against the war, 10 years after the beginning of the war on terror, of the horrendous slaughter of Iraq and Afghanistan, to continue the struggle against war, to fight over those questions of oppression, to fight for the liberation of Palestine, but also to focus on the key messages, to say the battle to win the bigger strikes in the autumn, to force them to name the day, to build the Unite the Resistance initiative, and above else, to make sure that in all those different struggles, we put forward a vision of a different sort of world, that we don't have to have as our highest hope that if we pulled down Cameron, that we would get Ed Miliband instead. There has to be something bigger and better than that. So we have to put forward a vision based in the reality of the living experience of the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions, of the mass strikes, of the potential of ordinary people to be much more than they're allowed to be under capitalism, of a fight for a world where people come before profit. That's what we are trying to organise for in the SWP. There is a huge challenge and a potential. We need more people inside our organisation, their energy and their initiative and what they will bring to us to make sure that the possibilities that are so clear after 30th of June, after the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa, that we turn those into a much higher and harder fight for a socialist future. Thanks, and thank you for everybody who spoke. You can feel in the room the possibility for a much higher level of struggle, of a workers' solution to the crisis, the possibility of talking about revolution in a way that feels quite different to any period that we can remember, the possibility of seeing it as a concrete possibility, not something that is simply a dream. And we have to be clear about what we focus on as we move forward, because the art of revolutionary leadership is about seizing the key link. It's about seeing what you focus on in order to move everything else. And when we talk about leadership, we don't mean finger wagging or a few people at the top of an organisation. We mean what everyone does in their workplace and their community to pull people behind them, to put forward the slogans and the ideas of the organisation which can carry forward the working class against its enemies. And the key link is to focus upon the potential for millions of people to be out on strike in the autumn, and then to say, when they come out on strike, to stay out until they win to bring down the government. That's the key link that we have in front of us. There will be many other things. The 2nd of October demonstration, the 3rd of September in Tower Hamlets. These are important moments, but the key link upon which we focus, as we did around the 30th of June, was to wage a political war in order to make sure that that feeling inside the working class for unity, for acting together, for we march together, let's strike together, for making sure that the 30th of June is replicated at a much higher level, and then that we stay out in order to achieve victory. That is the key link that we have now to seize. And it's important because if we achieve that, it will be important for everybody else. The comrade asked about the unemployed. The best thing for the unemployed is for them to be involved around pushing for the unions to fight, the unity of employed and unemployed workers together, because if we get that big strike, it will be the best answer to those who blame people on benefits for the crisis. It will be turning the anger and the fury against those at the top of society rather than those at the bottom. It will be a barrier against racism and Islamophobia, because when people were on the picket lines and on the demonstrations on the 30th of June, nobody blamed immigrants for the problem. Nobody blamed Muslims for the problem. They blamed the Tories and the bosses and the politicians who protect them. That's what a general strike could do. It could raise everyone up against the real enemy. And that's why it's the key link to use the power of organised workers, to use the social and economic power of workers to pull behind them every other element in society that wants to fight. And if we're going to get that, the feeling in this room of a mighty army preparing for combat has to involve more people. That we have to go out from this room determined to make sure we are going to struggle together to get a higher level of struggle, to get the general strike, to get the millions out on strike on the autumn, to popularise the slogan of all out and stay out. We have to work together in order to do that around socialist politics. And that's why we need a bigger socialist workers' party. Why, if you're not a member, join us to be part of that agitation and fighting for a socialist future.